on reentry for young men and women that were in America's juvenile justice system. I think one of the most important things for persons like myself that have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system is that people inside correctional facilities, whether juvenile or adult, have someone that they can connect to that can help them navigate, so to speak, the criminal justice system while they're inside the system to make a successful re-entry into society. And so I've been focused on that work for a number of years because it's a passion of mine. I've been directly impacted by the criminal justice system myself. I'll get a little bit more into my own personal connection and story to this topic matter tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. There are restrooms here right outside in the hallway for those that are not from this Jackson area. I mean, we've got a couple people who travel from out of town. There's a male restroom and a ladies' restroom right outside these doors. The rear entrance is right here down this hallway, and upstairs is back out to the front. The Jackson District Library has been gracious to partner with me on this and provide me a great space and great technical support. And we thank you, Courtney, for being here for us. Really appreciate that. The Jackson District Library is also seeking tutors right now for their literacy program, their adult literacy program. And so if anyone is here really interested in helping our community in any capacity, get with Courtney. She'll give you more information about their literacy program that you can become a tutor on. They will be doing training for tutors, about a 2-week training next month in November. And so if you have time, interest, and want to help the Jackson District Library, please volunteer and help with your time and help in literacy. It's very important. I also have done a lot of literacy work for those that know. I've made a connection between literacy and the criminal justice system at an early age. As you know, 75% of people incarcerated are high school dropouts, right? And of those high school dropouts, a high percentage of them come in with low literacy scores, meaning that they come in sometimes with 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade reading levels. And this is an indicator of the criminal justice trap, so to speak, so that those that aren't educated, that haven't graduated high school, they find themselves ultimately in the criminal justice system because, of course, without an education, it's very difficult to find employment. Without employment, you can't provide housing for yourself. If you don't have housing nor employment, chances are you may turn to crime as a means of survival. And aside from just turning to crime, oftentimes what happens is to deal with the trauma of that and the emotional pain of being in poverty, being homeless, and things of that nature, oftentimes we turn to substance abuse, right? And so we use substances as a means of self-medication in order to cope with these feelings that we're having. And so inside the criminal justice system, it's filled with people who have substance abuse issues as well as economic issues, poverty issues, right? And low literacy scores contributes to that a great deal. Tonight, we're on Seminar 4, Workshop 4, in this Trauma-Informed Education series. So I'm going to walk you through briefly the abstract and the overview of this criminal justice, or not this criminal justice, this Trauma-Informed Education series, talking about why it's important to have the multitude of discussions that we're having in this Trauma-Informed series. It goes into July of next year, and then at that time we hope to really consolidate it and really offer it in a real collective format to universities and communities across the country. It's really the hope of this and the aim of this. So I'm going to walk you through several areas of this tonight's discussion. As you know, that we're on number 4 now, October 24th. We've already had a discussion of the impacts of violence trauma and its impacts on youth and what happens to young people who experience childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. We talked about sexual trauma. We investigated the layers of historical sexual trauma within the African American community. Catherine Hall was here and gave an excellent presentation on that. And the video is online. We're currently live online, so all these discussions we're having are online. Selena, who was here today, I've seen her somewhere. She's right back there. She came and gave a powerful presentation last month on understanding the trauma of child abuse and neglect, particularly sexual trauma. Partial to girls was a very, very important discussion. I mean, it was a discussion that opened up so much more conversation about trauma and how we can really seek healing from the forms of trauma that we experience. Tonight we're talking about the system of mass incarceration. Next month we'll be talking about the trauma of the systematic design to deprive black and brown people of economic prosperity. So we're talking about the trauma of poverty. What happens to young kids that grow up in poverty, right? The CDC has said that the most pervasive problem affecting children's health is poverty, right? Their health outcomes are dictated by their economic status, right? So the the more well off you are, the greater chances are you have to have better health. But the more poor you are, the likelihood that you'll have poorer health, right? And there's a lot of different reasons for that. A lot of historic, generational, systematic racism issues of why that is the case. We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion in January. Keisha will be here talking about that. Talking about, particularly for a lot of people who don't understand, when we're talking about generational trauma and systematic trauma that's impacted the black and brown communities of America, some of the most menial topics, for example, I'm labeling it menial, but it's really not. We think they're unrelated, so to speak, to historic generational racism in this country, but it's directly related. Some of the things that impact the black family are so intrinsic, such as redlining. See, redlining was a system in America in which banks and mortgage companies literally drew red lines on maps and said that blacks, we won't give them loans in these areas. They can't live in these neighborhoods. Segregation, of course, right? But what people don't understand is that behind that creates generational trauma. Trauma with the generation directly impacted by it, and then successive trauma that's impacting the generations that's raised after that. Where we grow up as children knowing that we can't go in that neighborhood, knowing that we can't live in that neighborhood, knowing that when we drive through Michigan Center, chances are if a white cop sees us and I'm black, I might get pulled over, right? That's all a part of redlining, right? Where we know that there's been a systematic attempt to keep us out of neighborhoods, or in some instances, keep us in neighborhoods, right? So the trauma that is very entrenched, and not only that connected to the trauma of redlining and housing discrimination, we're also talking about the trauma of employment discrimination, where African Americans, peoples of color, work in predominantly white businesses, right? And sometimes some black women are the only black women in that office or in that department. Likewise with the black male, the only one in that area, or one or two other people, and they have to kind of sneak around about some of the conversations they can have, and they're fearful of losing their jobs, and there's a lot of trauma built into that. So that discussion is going to be very, very important for us to have, because these are the types of conversations around trauma, the impacts of trauma that we're not having. In February, John Wilkie is here. He'll be talking about the trauma of mental health crisis among black children, especially in alternative education. As we talked about last month and each month before, for a young child to be labeled as special education or ultimately sent to a so-called alternative school, there's trauma in that. There's a trauma that impacts that child's life, their sense of self-esteem, that they've been labeled with a category that sometimes we as society treat them as different or less, right, or problematic. And that produces trauma, produces a very severe trauma, and it impacts the health outcomes, right? So if you're experiencing trauma, the trauma that you experience actually impacts the physical, the mental and emotional well-being of that child. And this is what we're talking about. In March, we're going to get off to the trauma of police encounters. Dr. Sylvester Moten will be here talking about that trauma, because it's a very serious trauma for even young children as old as 4 and 5 years old see the police and get scared. And so generationally, that's been handed down from one generation to the next, a fear of a police encounter. That fear produces an internal trauma. That internal trauma produces a health outcome that is harmful to one's well-being. And we're going to get off into that really on April 21st with Nicoya. She's going to really talk about the impact of health crisis. She's going to bring all these, the impacts of trauma, what it's doing to the health, what it's doing to the brain, right? Because the brain gets rewired. The genetics change. I'm going to talk about some of that today, right? The genetics actually change when you experience trauma, right? In the body, the physiology changes. We got a great opportunity on May 19th, which is Malcolm X's birthday. Janar Yakub Williams will be coming from Cornell University. He's going to be talking about the enduring legacy of slavery, the trauma of self-hatred and inferiority complex among people of color. Very important topic, particularly in the black community, because we know that we suffer from inferiority complex. We know that in spite of how much we've grown, how much we have a sense of self-pride, we know that there's deep layers generationally that have removed the strength and power of belief in self, of having a sense of courage about who you are, you know, a sense of great self-esteem and pride for just being who you are. Because during slavery, that had to be stripped of a slave. You couldn't have that kind of self-pride because you wouldn't have accepted slavery. You would have rose up and revolted because by natural selection, it would have been your fate to fight and rebel, to have freedom in your life, right? So to remove that from you, they had to implant inside of us a sense of self-hatred, a worthlessness. You were worthless as a black person. You were 3/5 of a human being, right? So that trauma generationally has impacted us to this very day, right? And there's internal trauma of it with the internal racism. Dark-skinned blacks against light-skinned blacks. Older against young. The young don't respect our elders, and our elders don't like the young because the young are crazy, so to speak, right? Where all these different layers are impacting us and impacting our lives, and it's creating serious, severe trauma. So it's a very important topic. White supremacist history, I'm actually trying to find someone else to come and really present on that, because to present on a topic of this nature, requires some very in-depth research to talk about the historical layers of a whitewashed history, meaning that history throughout the world, not just America, throughout the world, has been taught to humanity in a very white supremacist way, meaning that all of the great achievements of peoples of color around the world, in ancient Asia, India, Africa, here on the indigenous people of North America and South America, their history has been secondary, has been put to the side and considered not as developed. For example, as Greece and Rome. And Greece and Rome were the direct byproducts of Egypt. And Egypt is in Africa, and the Egyptians were African, right? But that history has been hidden for so long, so that a whitewashed history has been taught in order to keep the dominant culture in power. With the trauma of that, the trauma being raised up, going to school every day, not being taught your history, not being taught that you and your history, your ancestors created anything worthy of historic contribution to humanity, causes a very severe trauma in young children today who barely even know who some of our recent historical figures were, some of our recent contributors to humanity, to civilization, to greatness, right? So we have to really talk about the historical layers of a whitewashed history and what that does to us psychologically, what that does to humanity. And lastly, on July 21st, we're going to have a panel discussion to talk about, we're going to bring all the speakers back, all the speakers that can be here, and we're going to have an open discussion and dialogue about the subject matters that we've been having, and really give our audience, because a lot of you are here today, have been here during this entire series, and I thank you for coming. We're going to give you a really chance to really talk about it and really contribute to the conversation and share with us what you've learned and what your thoughts are on this topic matter. We have a very deep subject matter tonight to get into. One is very near and dear to me, one that I've been directly impacted by, the criminal justice system. So I'm gonna try to get right into it, because I got a lot packed inside it. There's a lot inside it. But in order to do so, I still have to kind of give some prefatory material, talk about my history and my connection to the criminal justice system. So, at the age of 10 years old, I first got picked up by the police and took home. Me and a very good childhood friend of mine, Damian Hall, was just being kids, running around outside Shahan, throwing rocks and stuff, and just doing little dumb stuff. And somebody called the police, and they picked us up and took us home. That was my first time having real police contact. Well, the next year, when I was 11, just before I turned 12, I got arrested at my school, elementary school, for doing the same thing again, throwing rocks. I had some strange history with throwing rocks. And so I was throwing rocks on recess. I started off throwing acorns. Little acorns you can catch and put between your fingers and whistle with. You pop the little corn out of it, and then the shell, you can whistle with it. So I was throwing those things first. And they really weren't going that far, and I was laughing and giggling, just being a little child. And I picked up a couple rocks, and I started throwing some rocks on the recess. Unbeknown to me, one of the rocks would come down and land on the head of my teacher, Miss Ross. And thank goodness she didn't get hurt, but she still got hit. So I can never, of course, describe the level of pain she felt, but she didn't get hurt. She didn't need surgery, didn't break skin, she didn't bleed or anything of that nature, but she still got hit. And the school system at the time decided to prosecute. And so I was prosecuted as an 11-year-old, charged with a felony assault, right? And they used two of my classmates who seen me throw the rock to testify against me at trial. I was found guilty by the judge, and I was sentenced at that moment to do 20 days in juvenile home and then like 8 weekends, right? they immediately ripped me from my mom right there at the courtroom. And I went right downstairs through the basement, right across to the juvenile center. And I stayed there for 20 days. And that began my exposure to the criminal justice system. The next year, or really the next school year, that same year, I turned 12 and went to Parkside as a 7th grader. My homeroom in the 100 block of Parkside, my next door teacher was the husband of the teacher I hit with the rock. So he told all the other teachers that I hit his wife with the rock. So now, every time I went in the classroom, it was an expectation that I was a problematic child. So suffice it to say, I didn't succeed at Parkside during that 7th grade year. And at the end of the school year, they sent a letter home and said, your son needs to go to alternative school. So I went to alternative school, which at that time was Sharp Park Academy. I went there, had great support from Don Tassi and Mr. Burton, who helped me get back to Parkside. Earned my way back to Parkside. Malik, how you doing? Very well, yourself. Good. I earned my way back to Parkside. And I still was having struggles at Parkside. It was the middle of the crack cocaine era. So my generation, young black males like myself, we were considered to be at risk. We were considered to be an endangered species, right? And so we were told that we were either going to be dead or in prison by 18. So that by the time I was in the 9th grade, I was already full-fledged living in the streets. I mean, I would go home at night, but by day, I was in the streets all day. And when I was first arrested and had that juvenile incarceration, that juvenile probation, I always continued to catch cases. I always continued to violate. So I never actually got off probation. I would just get a new case and get a new probation. Extended. I was always under supervision. Such an extent that by the time I was 17, I had already moved away from Jackson in 1989. I moved to Lansing, and it was a bigger city. The crack cocaine game was much more expansive in Lansing than it was in Jackson. In 1989 was a tumultuous year for Jackson and for Lansing. And I got deeply involved in the crack era at that time. Exposure to large amounts of weight of cocaine. So therefore that brought about a lot of violence. People that were in the game at that level carried guns. I carried guns. Unfortunately, I shot someone for the first time at the age of 16 before I turned 17. And then when I turned 17, I got arrested for possession of a firearm. And I shot a few more people, unfortunately. And I never was charged. I got arrested for a few of them. Thank goodness nobody died. And I really, at that time, really wasn't conscientious of my behavior as really problematic because it was so endemic. It was so normal for my generation of young people that this was our life. This was our life. This is how we woke up and went to sleep every single day. And so it became second nature for me to be involved in this level of lifestyle. The trauma that I had experienced as a young child of witnessing a murder at the age of 10, I hadn't connected that, of course, and I hadn't matured enough to analyze that, to see how this was impacting my behavior and how I was using firearms to injure people. So at the age of 17, I got caught with a firearm, got out on bail, was fighting the case, was on probation still from Jackson, transferred to probation there, hadn't succeeded. I got out, I got sentenced to 4 months in the county jail. I got out and I went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1991. I turned 18, and about a month after I turned 18, I was arrested once again. This arrest was for a battery at a liquor store. I had gotten a fight at a liquor store at about 1:40 at night. Me and a young man bumped into each other inside the store. I took offense to it. When you come outside the store, it's going down, and that's what happened. He fled, ran home. I chased him to his house. His mother called the police. The police came, chased us. I went back to my house. They came and arrested me the next day. Once I got in custody, me and 2 other individuals, they put us in separate interrogation rooms, and they told each one of us, one by one, that the other one had confessed to an unsolved murder that happened 3 weeks prior to our arrest. A murder none of us knew anything about. We had no knowledge, no awareness of this crime. So after a week of these types of interrogations, them not convincing me to confess to a crime I didn't commit, they convinced a young man named Mark Henry to confess, believing that I confessed and pointed the finger at him. He confessed, signed a statement. I was charged with murder. Me and a friend of mine named Joe Robinson. We were given $1 million bail, ultimately went to the preliminary hearing, got bound over, went to trial, off his testimony, got found guilty, sentenced to 45 years in prison. Took me 15 years to actually win my freedom. During those 15 years, I finally got a chance to really analyze what happened to me. How did I get here in this prison cell with a 45-year sentence for a murder I had absolutely no idea who committed? So during that analyzation period is the time I really got involved in criminal justice advocacy. But first I had to understand what happened to me, the trauma, what really impacted me to lead me to make the decisions and choices that I made. Not only was I affected and impacted by generations of sociological conditions that happened to my community, the community I come from, how my father was impacted, how my mother was impacted by the things leading up to the moment of my life, but I also came to realize how I was directly impacted by the experiences that I experienced. So a combination of the generational experiences and my own experiences created a scenario for me to have ultimately made the bad decisions and choices I made that continue to keep me in a repetitive cycle of criminal justice system. So when I got out of prison, it was by the luck of the draw that I really got out of prison. Really, it wasn't because, for example, the court said, "Oh wow, we made a huge mistake. You know, we're going to let you out." It's not how the courts handled it. I was fortunate to get out of prison because the Wisconsin parole chairman happened to be convinced that I was worthy of being released. I had the Wisconsin Innocence Project fighting for me to get out of prison. They took my case to him and sat down with him and said, "Hey, we got somebody that's wrongly incarcerated. Not only is he wrongly incarcerated over the last 15 years, but over the last 15 years, the type of man that he has become makes him worthy of being released. He doesn't belong here in prison." So combining those two things together, he granted me release on parole. 13 years ago, in 2006, to this day, I still remain on parole for a crime I didn't commit. So since 1985 until 2019, I've been in the criminal justice system without a single day of being free from the criminal justice system. I've always had supervision in my life. So I've been deeply entrenched in the trauma of mass incarceration. So that's what puts me in a very precarious position to talk about this subject matter tonight. And there's so much to unpack with the trauma of mass incarceration that we really got to really get deep into it. So I'm not going to hold you longer than the time we have, and it's really not going to take me a whole lot of time to walk you through some of these slides that I have, some of the slides you have in front of you, but to really dig deep into some of the underlying layers of what's in there. It's going to take a little bit of time, a little bit of concentration to really have a full dialogue with you about the trauma of mass incarceration, because it's pretty entrenched, pretty severe. So I'm going to jump to the abstract of this whole entire series and what we're getting into. The abstract is the systematic and historic effects of embedded racial injustice and social oppressions have produced generational trauma among blacks in America and other communities of color, most of which have gone undiagnosed and untreated. Like, to talk about generational trauma is a new subject. We haven't really been talking about it. We talked about generational trauma, for example, in some studies in the 60s as it related to Native Americans. Right? We talked about some generational trauma as it affected the Jews after the Holocaust. But we never talked about generational trauma as it affected the black American community, who have been endured over almost 300 years of legalized slavery, and then another 140 years of other legalized, institutionalized forms of enslavement, such as convict leasing, peonage, Jim Crowism, a lot of other things, segregation and discrimination that still endure to this day, right? And we haven't talked about the generational effects of that, the real trauma that impacts our lives. So this trauma has similarly produced multiple layers of mental illness. Like, it's sad that we often describe so many people in our community as crazy, right? We say, "Oh, so-and-so is crazy. These kids is crazy." And it's sad for us to use stigmatizing language. But really, underneath that is mental illness. We do have a lot of severe, undiagnosed mental illness, and it's not somebody's crazy. It's that we have generational trauma that's impacted our young people who grow into become adults and live out their generational youth trauma as adults. Undiagnosed, untreated. We have some very severe issues that we need to address. So we can't address it until we have these conversations to educate and inform the community about what contributed to this. What is the generational and the prognosis, so to speak, right? What is the history of it, and what's the evolution of it? Where are we going to go in the future now? How are we going to heal ourselves from this? Depression and stress-induced behaviors leading to generational poverty, self-hatred, broken family structures, and an inclination towards substance abuse, alcoholism, and incarceration. This seminar description, these are for all of the seminars. This education seminars will highlight the theoretical framework of trauma, its causes and effects, symptoms and associated responses, with direct reference to the specific psychological trauma that communities of color experience as a result of racial injustice and social oppression as exhibited historically and presently within the United States. Our objectives is the conceptual framework of trauma impact, identifying traumatic experiences, symptoms, and their responses, contextualizing trauma in relation to the Black experience, and treatment options and resources to address trauma informed by this context. Our particular treatment method that we use is called a healing-centered engagement, and I'll teach you more and tell you more about that as we get to it. So let's get into the topic matter at hand. So let's define trauma. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders defines trauma as direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury, threat to one's physical integrity, witnessing an event that involves the above experience, learning about unexpected or violent death, serious harm or threat of death, or injury experienced by a family member or close associate. Memories associated with trauma are typically explicit, coherent, and difficult to forget. We call this post-traumatic stress disorder, right? After the event, right? But the impacts after the event are sometimes worse than the shock of the event. And so, generally, trauma is defined as an event, right? Or a series of events. But generational trauma takes on a different conversation, right? Because generational trauma talks about the trauma that's handed down from generation to generation. What that means is that when a family member, a person, experiences trauma, and that trauma is untreated, when they grow and become adults and have children, they then begin to pass that on to the next child that they're raising because it has been untreated, undiagnosed. So some of the symptoms that they experience in life become handed down to the children as norms of life, right? As norms of life. So oftentimes we blame parents for things that are happening to children. But we're only citing the immediate connection, the parent right now. But what about the parent before that parent? And the parent before that parent? But then what about what induced that parent to have the symptoms associated with their mental illness? What produced that? Did slavery produce that? Right? We have to talk about that. We have to talk about the generational systematic impact post-slavery, right? So this is what we're going to get off into. What is complex trauma? Because generational trauma is complex trauma. The term complex trauma describes exposure to multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive, interpersonal nature, and the wide-ranging, long-term impact of this exposure. These events are severe and pervasive, such as abuse or profound neglect. They usually begin early in life and can disrupt many aspects of the child's development. Later in life, heal outcomes and the formation of a self. Later in life, heal outcomes. Child development, later in life, heal outcomes. I don't know what, I might have been an error right there. I don't know what that's saying. Development, later in life, heal outcomes, and the formation of a self. Nice. Yes. Can you touch the mouse on that computer so it don't go dormant? Thank you. But in the event, this complex trauma is the complexity of the problem is when all these different layers and these continuation of it continue to persist, continue to go undiagnosed and untreated, right? So it produces complex trauma, not just a trauma or, for example, a car accident produces, a traumatic experience, right? But when you have a car accident followed by you didn't have insurance. Now your insurance, you've lost your vehicle, and as a result of losing your vehicle, you lost your job. As a result of losing your job, you can't pay your rent, so you got evicted. As a result of getting evicted, Child Protective Services comes and removes your children. So all these different layers produce complex trauma that impacts you. Some people never bounce back from situations like that. And that's just one example. Let's talk about intergenerational trauma. Dr. Michael Holleran, he produced several different books important to education as it relates to childhood trauma, and specifically as it relates to school discipline, and how children are impacted by school discipline policies and adverse childhood experiences. In one of his books, his publications, Healthcare and Public Services, he talks about African American experience much higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and negative health outcomes in comparison to whites in the U.S. He says, the intergenerational cultural trauma caused by 300 years of slavery, alongside the poor economic circumstances and social prejudice, has led to the poor state of physical, psychological, and social health among African Americans. So this portion of this slide, this topic, is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the ultimate poor health outcomes as a result of generational systematic trauma that's impacted the black community. And oftentimes in our society, we don't understand why the black community is in the condition it's in. We think that it's just a matter of they need to make better decisions and better choices. You know, so-and-so made it out of the hood. Well, it's not that easy when you're talking about a disease, right? Trauma is a disease. It's an illness that every one of us, for example, me and you could have the same exact diagnosis, but we respond to treatment. So your illness may persist longer than mine because of the way I respond to treatment. We may have two different doctors diagnosed with the same condition. My doctor may have a different approach than your doctor. And so therefore your symptoms may persist longer than my symptoms. So what's happening in our community, you have to see it in that way, that we all are having the same prescriptions given to us to heal us from our generational trauma. We're scattered all across the country, right? We have there's different time parameters impacted, right? Some people who live in the South are still under different Southern generational traumas, and we migrated from the North. So we got freed from some other traumas that are still impacting people in the South and aren't impacting people in the North. And then we got our own different traumas coming to the North that people in the South don't experience. Right? So there's a lot of different things in these conversations that we don't think about. We don't understand why our condition is the way it is, but we haven't properly diagnosed it. That's why. We haven't had these kinds of conversations about generational trauma. So, what are some of the signs and symptoms of trauma? These are all the things we witness every day in anybody's life, and this isn't just specific to the African American community. Shock is one of the first things that we experience in trauma. Right? If some traumatic event happened or a series of events happen, it's shock. Sadness and hopelessness. Denial and disbelief. Like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. Some people who lose children, for example, live in denial for a long time that their child is gone. Right? That their child has been murdered, for example, or died in a car accident. Right? Trauma produces disbelief. Denial. Isolation. We begin to isolate ourselves. People who are incarcerated specifically learn to isolate themselves because it's an isolated environment. Right? And inside prison, we have what's called segregation. Right? Where people who were in prison already segregated from society then become segregated inside the segregated society. Right? And that produces trauma, severe trauma. One of the good friends of mine has done so much time in segregation. He's been incarcerated now since 1994 or 5. And he's been in segregation probably 20 years of all that time. About 20 years out of 24, 25 years. Very little time in general population. At one moment, the courts ordered him released from segregation because he had become catatonic. He had literally would sit on his bunk and not move for days. For days. Catatonic. The mental health illness sat in tragically for people that are segregated. As humans, part of our humanity is socializing. That's one of the ways we grow. Just think if we produced a child, a baby, and just left it outside somewhere. It's it's not going to grow. That child is not going to learn the things it needs to learn and develop because it's not going to socialize. You know what I mean? There's a very important element to our educating our children, to raising our children in socializing. As humans, we continue to grow through our socialization. In prison, oftentimes it's the wrong type of socialization, right? It's a very restricted, controlled socialization, right? So it produces severe trauma. We're going to get deeper into some of these things. Confusion, guilt, shame, anger, irritability, mood swings, substance use, anxiety, stress, risky behaviors, withdrawals, sudden violent outbursts. These are all the symptoms of trauma. So if we were to really think about what's happening in the black community, for example, with some of our young generation, these are all the signs we see. We see these things quite regularly, right? And we see these things persisting generationally, year after year, generation after generation, decade after decade, etc. And we have seen these things for quite some time. So how do we get here, really? How do we get to an extent to where generational trauma within the African-American community has translated into what we call the trauma of mass incarceration? The trauma of modern-day enslavement, right? We're not talking about old enslavement of, the 1600s. We're talking about there's a form of enslavement today, right now in America. We have jails surrounding us. This is prison city, right? We have to go back into history and study some things. And let's talk about those right now. The slave trade, the beginning stages of generational trauma. How many people here know about the history of the Iberian Peninsula? Ever heard of the Iberian Peninsula? Iberian Peninsula. El Andalusia is what it was called by the Moors of North Africa. So, three specific sets of racial ethnic groups, right? The Berbers of North Africa, the West Africans, and the Arabs, all combined together, all having been Muslim, ultimately went across the Strait of Gibraltar in around 700 AD. And it went across the Strait of Gibraltar into southern Spain, what was called the Iberian Peninsula, before it was called Spain, which Portugal is there, of course, and France is connected to Spain. And they began to conquer it and rule it for 800 years. They gave birth to the European Renaissance. At this time in 700 AD, Europe was in the Dark Ages. They didn't have technology. They didn't have culture. Greece and Rome were the thing of the past, right? That was gone. But the Moors, they were called the Moors because they were black. They were complexion. They were people of color. They were called the Moors by the Europeans, who called them the Moors, right? Or the Moors. And so they brought electricity, essentially, what we consider electricity today, to Europe. They had running water. They had all kinds of advanced technology that we can't even imagine. They created the astrolabe, right? They created so many scientific things that we use today that is unbelievable. Most of us would be astonished by how much of our civilization today owes its existence to the Iberian Peninsula, to the Moors of Spain. Well, of course, by the time 1492 came around, Christendom, Europe had, gained some power and began launching crusades back to try to reclaim the Holy Lands, which was a whole different another war. And during this time, they were trying to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. They ultimately got a chance to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula and kick the rest of the Moors out in the year 1492. And once the Queen had gained control back over Europe, she sent Christopher Columbus to the so-called New World that had been explored and traveled and populated for thousands of years. It was new to Europe. The Vikings that came across, and Scandinavian portions of Scandinavians came across in portions of Canada, Newfoundland, places of that nature. But they had to come to the so-called New World, which is the South American continent, Central America, and ultimately North America. They hadn't had that kind of contact yet, even though people were already living here. Civilizations were already here, advanced civilizations, right? So Christopher Columbus ultimately came to America, or he didn't make it to North America, he made it to South America and Central America. And while he was there, he wrote some deeply, for many people, deeply disturbing journals. Some of the things that he did, some of the people he enslaved. But he wrote some very insightful things about the people he came in contact with, the ways, how they were living their lives, some of the landscapes and things of that nature. So his journal, of what he saw is very deep reading. A lot of people haven't never really read his journals as a commander of the fleet ship, a naval expedition ship. He was a commander, And so anyway, in 1492, 1493, Christopher Columbus, he returns to Spain with some indigenous people from Central America and South America that he had met. Took them back to Spain, showed them off, enslaved them essentially. He enslaved them and took them back. By 1499, Amerigo Vespucci, he took 200 people from South America and sells them on Cadiz, which is an island south of Spain. He sold them in Spain, took 200 people back and sold them. So at that time, the Portuguese, people were already enslaved in Europe. Right? Slavery wasn't a new institution, right? It became a new institution in America. So-called chattel slavery became a totally new, different form of slavery that humanity had never seen before. So by 1526, enslaved Africans were forced to help a Spanish expedition establish an outpost in present-day South Carolina, right? So they were forced. They came here. They brought them here, and they forced them to do that. By 1560, a well-known slave trader by the name of Sir John Hawkins, he led 4 slave trading expeditions to the Americas, and essentially thus began multiple expeditions from Europe to America to bring slaves here to this country. Now, a lot of research has been talking about how many ultimately became slaves came from South America, never came from Africa. Well, that's not talked about much of that. How many people were enslaved in South America, brought to North America, castigated as Africans from West Africa, but was originally indigenous people all along. That's another history that hasn't really been talked about much. There were also many Native Americans that were here that people could classify as being black or African, because some of the explorers who came here described them as looking like the Ethiopians or looking like the Indians from India, who were always the brown-skinned complected people. So thus began a long history of the beginning stages of slavery. And it's a peculiar history. It'll take us a week to really talk about the history of slavery in America. But what I really want to pinpoint is the traumatic impacts of what became slavery in America and how it affected the ultimate generation that lives and breathes today. So that's what we're going to get off into. So we're going to talk about chattel slavery. As a result of black Africans having absolutely no legal rights in America whatsoever as people, they were able to justify chattel slavery, meaning that people were branded ownership of a slave master, right? So blacks became the personal property of white landowners in the Americas. Branded physically, in early years, they were branded like cows and livestock were branded physically, so they could tell who their property was. They didn't continue that on throughout the history. They stopped that slowly but surely, but it was something they did. They physically branded people. They renamed many of the Africans, of course. They took their last names or gave them a last name. Don't forget to hit that and keep it alive. They took their names from them. We know about the history, for example, in the autobiography of Roots about Kunta Kinte and his people and his family members who were given names, and Chicken George, and you're going to learn your name, and they were being punished for not accepting the names, and etc. So that was a reality. They were bought and sold to others, no rights under any law, worked fields 12 to 18 hours a day, very little time to sleep. Slavery was oppressively brutal. I mean, very, very, very brutal. Women regularly were raped. Men often whipped, some to death. Children sold away from their parents. Think of that trauma. Think of what happens today when we take children from their parents, whether it be Child Protective Services or if a parent dies or whatever, and they're stripped away from their parent. What type of trauma sets into that child? Not having that connection, that loving connection, right? That is needed and essential. This became a part of life in America, where children were regularly sold away to other plantations, right? Or parents were sold away to other plantations and the children remained, right? Regularly. Was fed leftovers. Most of the food, a lot of it that we call soul food or southern food, was our ability to harness a meal from nothing. we were able to take the scraps and whip up something that we could survive off of it. A lot of that became what is known as soul food or southern food. Slaves were regularly terrorized, meaning that oftentimes you have to understand that slaves will be living in their own little quarters, their own shanty quarters behind a slave plantation. And regularly, slave masters, their children, the white teenage children who were growing up with, knowing they're going to be the inheritors of these slaves in the future, they would regularly come and terrorize them and, threaten them, take the women away and go rape them and terrorize everyone else and, essentially bully them into submission, right? This went on for decades, for generations and generations. So you can only imagine what's happening mentally and emotionally to a people living in this condition, right? And they were also forcibly converted to Christianity. And many of them who came here had different forms of religious beliefs, different forms of religious systems, different forms of spirituality. All that was suppressed. All that was suppressed from them. So they were disconnected from their own spirituality, right? What came next? We know that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which oftentimes has been attributed to ending slavery, but it really wasn't in itself about really ending slavery as it was to saving the Union, right? It really was about saving the Union. That we're going to have to sign this document, essentially, to save the Union, to save the country from dividing in half, basically. And so it's after he signed the Emancipation Proclamation and blacks were freed, and many of them, of course, didn't know they were freed. Of course, we know about Juneteenth, where, several, decades later, some African slaves in Texas found out that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and they knew that they were free then. So what happened in the first few decades of freedom was unprecedented. A lot of former slaves rose to political power. Because if you remember, many blacks who were let go from plantations were let go from plantations, and they left. They went and had lands that they went and inhabited and started cultivating the land and living their own lives separate from the rest of society. Fearful of being trapped and sold back or trapped back into some form of slavery, what became sharecropping, which we're going to talk about, right? And so they began to run for office. During the early American Renaissance, we had more black elected officials than we have today, right? But what happened was whites started fearing blacks coming to power. Because think about this. Blacks were the ones that had all of the agricultural knowledge. We raised the crops, right? We raised the crops. So that without us on plantations, raising the crops, taking care of the crops, the white landowners suffered severely. Severe lack of knowledge of how to maintain fields and crops and not having the bodies to maintain fields. Started creating a disparity in the new economic development that freed blacks were starting to have. So they began to start a systematic process of figuring out how they were going to re-enslave blacks, essentially, a new form of legalized slavery that we can get them back on our plantation to work for us. Thus started sharecropping, for example. They would invite blacks back to the plantation and say, you're not living so well out there. We'll give you room and board, basically take care of our crops, and you can live here, and you earn your keep. We'll feed you and clothe you, right? Which was a trickery, a form to trick them back into slavery. But something even more menacing took place after that, and it's called peonage, in which freed blacks were then forced back into slavery by being arrested. Thus, the kind of beginning of mass incarceration, a new form of slavery. They passed some laws under the new Jim Crow laws, right? Before we think of Jim Crow, oftentimes we think of the Civil Rights era Jim Crow, 40s and the 50s. But in the 1800s, there was a Jim Crow, the beginning of Jim Crow. And they passed these vagrancy laws that if you didn't have a job, couldn't prove that you had a job in residency, then you were arrested. Not having committed any crime against humanity or society or committed crimes against a person, just by not having a job, you were arrested. And because you couldn't afford to pay your fine for going to court, slavery, and you had to go work the fields, the mines, to earn your freedom. We're going to get off into that real deeply right now. What is peonage? Peonage was debtor slavery, an institution whereby emancipated slaves were arrested and forced to earn their freedom by working plantations and coal mines in southern states until their debt was repaid. You know what we talk about today? When a person goes to jail and they get out, they've done what? Paid their debt to society. It goes back to peonage. We don't understand that connection, right? It goes back to peonage, right? So you had to pay a debt to get your freedom. So the tie-ins to institutionalized slavery and mass incarceration today is really well-rooted in that history. Vagrancy, a charge whereby a black person could be arrested for not being employed and then sold to a plantation or coal mine to work off their fine for being vagrant. For being vagrant. Simply not having a job, you could be back in slavery. But check this out. Black codes began, which is the beginning of Jim Crow, as early as 1865. 1865. Laws began to be passed that came to be known as black codes. These laws came about after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which legalized the reinstitution of slavery for conviction of a crime, which they passed the vagrancy law, right? So they're creating modern-day incarceration. They governed when, where, and how freed blacks could work and for how much compensation. These laws were designated or designed to place blacks into indentured servitude, that is, legalized slavery, otherwise known as peonage or convict leasing and sharecropping. Ex-Confederate soldiers worked as the police and the judges. The ex-Confederate soldiers who fought to keep people in slavery. Upwards of 75% of blacks sentenced under these laws died before their sentences were complete, which is roughly about 2 to 4 years. Most people died in 2 to 4 years because they would be worked literally to death in coal mines, right, and on plantations. By 1880, freed blacks began moving into cities, and black codes were then extended to cities. Remember, this is in the rural South back there. Black codes in cities were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws expanded to include places prohibited. Like, for example, parks and things of that nature. People who know the history, even, 60 years ago, you couldn't go to certain parks and certain beaches in the South without getting arrested, beat, and lynched legally. Public restaurants, parks, etc. And what followed that was a very severe form of terrorism in America known as lynching. Lynching, or the public and sometimes secret. What I mean by that is oftentimes blacks will be kidnapped and found hung, and no one even know about it. But they did it very publicly as a public terrorist act to put it on display to such an extent that newspapers would advertise it. Newspapers would advertise mob of whites to hang 4 blacks tomorrow at noon. This would be on the front page of the paper. And they would post it all over, and people would come and flock to watch this public hanging. Terrorism. Can you imagine what type of impact that's having on a young black child growing up knowing that he or she can be lynched at any given time and there was no law to protect them whatsoever? Trauma sets in. Lynching was even done for entertainment purposes, and according to some researchers, was known as a picnic or a pick a nigga. That's where some researchers say the word comes from. Others will dispute that and give another definition for it. But some researchers say the word picnic comes from the South to pick a nigga as an entertainment. Do your research. It's out there. By 1889, well-known historical figure, many of our kids today don't know nothing about her, Ida B. Wells began documenting school segregation, sexual harassment, and lynchings. She began documenting it. She co-founded a newspaper and began publicizing these atrocious acts that was happening in so-called the land of the free. Ida B. Wells co-founded the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. How many people here know about the city of Chicago? Know about Chicago? Know about the Chicago Defender? Chicago. Well, the Memphis Free Light is really a precursor to the Chicago Defender. We're going to talk about that. She published, co-founded Memphis Free Speech and Headline newspaper and wrote about these human and civil rights violations and began shaming America. Shame on you Americans for claiming to be a democracy, claiming to be the land of the free, and look what you're doing to your citizens. Look what you're doing to people. You're hanging them. You're segregating against them, etc. Ida B. Wells was forced to flee the South. She was forced to flee. They was going to kill her. They burnt down her newspaper building in Memphis, and she had to flee. And when she went to Chicago, right? Many people know about the Ida B. Wells projects in Chicago. I think they might have tore them down. In Chicago, they tear Ida B. Wells down yet? They tore them down after the system. She was forced to flee, and her newspaper press was destroyed by a white mob. By World War I, lynchings had became a prevalent part of life in the South. People could just be riding down the street and see blacks hanging from a tree. They call it strange fruit, right? You could just see it. It was just out there, regularly. You know, at nighttime, you may be driving home from work or walking home from work, and on your way to work in the next morning, you can see a couple bodies hanging from a tree. That's how prevalent it was. Thousands and thousands of people were lynched, more undocumented than we could ever imagine. By 1919, race riots were on the rise, and in 1919 alone, there were 23 race riots. 23 people were fighting for their freedom. They weren't going to continue to tolerate this. A lot of this is undocumented. I mean, it's documented, but it's not publicized. They don't talk about in the early 1900s there was race riots where blacks were fighting for their freedom. That's why they became much more oppressive during the 40s and 50s to repress blacks from rising up and seeking freedom. By the 1920s, blacks reestablished a press and founded the Chicago Defender, encouraging blacks to migrate north. They were just constantly encouraging blacks to come north, get away from the South. They're killing y'all down there. Come north. Even though there were some lynchings up here in the north, but it wasn't like the South, of course. So let's get to the Jim Crow era, the 1950s. By 1950s, blacks were subjugated to massive and harsh segregation laws. In cities like Montgomery, Birmingham, Memphis, and Atlanta, blacks began organizing to challenge Jim Crow laws. Some of this history is more so familiar to us, right? A movement arose that came to be known as the Civil Rights Movement. By the end of the 1960s, blacks had succeeded in getting legislation passed that legally outlawed Jim Crow and segregation. For example, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Civil Rights Act of 64. A lot of these things most of us know about. Dr. King was involved in them, of course, and many others. As a result of a migration of blacks, spawned from the South to the North in the 60s, which my family, for example, came to Michigan in 1964, having left the South, having left Haytime, Missouri. Let's talk about the expansion of the new Jim Crow. By the 1970s, blacks were living across the country in large populated cities, such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Detroit, Indianapolis, Chicago, Milwaukee, and West Coast cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, Las Vegas. Slowly, we began to see the continuation of black codes under the skies, where new clandestine tactics were used to re-enslave blacks by incarcerating them in state prisons, right? Black neighborhoods became targets of over-policing and harassment, something we still see today. We still see our communities over-policed. We think that the solution to the crime in our community is to put more police in our neighborhoods. That's not the solution whatsoever. That's just the continuation of a long-term effect of over-policing that leads to incarceration. What communities need is resources, economic opportunities that are equal and equitable, so that those communities can thrive and be like communities where you don't need policing, right? Because those communities don't need policing not because they're not black. No, they don't need policing because they have the economic resources in their community. Because their bi-weekly and monthly food is met in their refrigerator when paychecks come. Whereas we need to eat and survive every single day. So we're out and about scavenging through our communities to make ends meet in order to survive. And police are in our community having more contact with us because we're out in our community more often than whites are in their community. They go home to rest and relax. We don't never go home to rest and relax. From day up to sundown, we're struggling to make our ends meet. They don't understand that. So policing is not a solution whatsoever. We don't need more police in our communities. Politicians seized upon issues impacting poor black communities and demonize them as criminal and thugs. Right? So this is one of the clandestine tactics to begin to find excuses to arrest and incarcerate. Right? A new form of these black code laws were then created, where they're not hovering our community and they're doing stop and frisk, for example. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Why are you in a group standing out here? Right? These types of things lead to ultimate incarceration. The age of mass incarceration, the new modern slave system. In 1970, the national prison and jail population was close to 500,000 persons incarcerated by 1970. In the 40s, 50s, 100,000, 200,000 here and there. By 1980, the prison population alone expanded to 500,000. By 1990, to 1 million. By 2000, it grew to 1.5 million. Today, it is over 2.5 million people incarcerated across this country. In spite of this key important point, crime has not risen. Crime has been going down. If crime is going down, why are incarceration rates going up? Why have longer sentences been growing? In the state of Wisconsin, for example, an armed robbery used to be 20 years. By 2000, it was 40 years. Right? So they're expanding incarceration lengths of time. The longer period of time they can keep people incarcerated. As crime is going down, something should be triggering our mind and saying this is not justified. That there's been an intentional design to incarcerate more black people. In comparison, in 1920, it was barely 100,000 people that was incarcerated. In 1960, it was slightly over 2,000. It stayed relatively steady until 1980. With the war on drugs declared originally by Nixon in 1970 and again by Reagan in 1983, the prison population skyrocketed. It skyrocketed. Now you got to think about the connection between the Civil Rights Act. Now blacks are freed from legalized Jim Crow. Right? Being freed from legalized Jim Crow, blacks were then free, so to speak, to go and pursue life as they wish and choose, to build economic communities, to build businesses. Right? And what happened was, the new design, the new political design was find ways to incarcerate. Find ways to incarcerate. Right? So they began to then demonize blacks, infiltrate the black community with drugs, the proliferation of guns. Like, we don't manufacture firepower weapons in our community. We don't have no connection to that. How are these weapons getting into a poor community? They can barely pay rent. How are some of these weapons that are $1,500 per weapon get in the hands of young 16-year-old kids? How is that happening? Right? It's by design. It's intentional. Crack cocaine was introduced into America's black communities. Right? Was introduced intentionally. We know the connection between Oliver North and Ronald Reagan and Rick Ross, the real Rick Ross, who I met and interviewed, who talked about, for example, his connection to CIA agents, who was helping him, allowing him to import cocaine from Central America, whom the Reagan administration was involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. Right? There was the Contras were in a war in Central America. And in order to help them, they were funneling weapons to them. Weapons that were paid for by cocaine proceeds. That Rick Ross, the real Rick Ross, was one of their top #1 distributors of cocaine across the country. He's the one that was responsible for the distribution of crack cocaine to Michigan. It made it to Michigan through his hands because his sister lives in Inkster, where he has nephews right now. He was able to establish a connection to Detroit with cocaine in the early 80s. He talks about it all the time. He was in Detroit a couple years ago speaking at the same high school I was at Osborne High School. He shares this openly. It's documented. It's well known. They've done research and found the physical evidence that connect the Reagan administration to the distribution of cocaine in the black community. So now we get to, all of this is happening. Blacks are under attack. The continuation of a new modern slave system is in effect. Hidden under the skies of criminals, crazy black people, welfare queen mothers, etc., etc. Hidden under this. To such an extent that society feels justified for looking at us and stigmatizing us in this way. Thinking we're criminals, thinking we're thugs. Right? So what's the effect of this? Today, black children live in terror of police contact. Live in literal terror of police contact. 1 in 3 black males will be arrested, jailed, or imprisoned at least once in their lifetime. At least once. They'll at least get arrested, if not just to go to jail overnight. 1 out of 3. They can't escape it. We can't escape it. The way the system is set up and structured. Black children represent 32% of youth arrested. Black youth represent 44% of the nearly 50,000 youth, it's really 60,000. The new statistic came out this year. 60,000 youth held in juvenile facilities, including residential treatment centers, detention centers, etc. Black youth represent 44% of that. Black youth are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth. In 2016, blacks accounted for 27% of all individuals arrested in the U.S., in spite of the fact that we only represent 12 to 13% of the population. Right? Driving while black is a norm in U.S. society, whereby blacks live in constant fear of being pulled over, harassed, and potentially arrested simply for being black behind the wheel. Right? That's a form of terrorism. It's a form of trauma that impacts our health. Impacted our health. The traumatic devastation of the criminal justice system. What is the traumatic devastation of that? It's living in constant fear of police contact. Having anxiety of being arrested. Right? We live with the anxiety that whites don't live with. You don't just, when you see a police, you're not in immediate fear unless you're doing something wrong. We ain't got to do nothing wrong for us to see a police and be in fear. Have done nothing wrong. We go to work every day, pay our bills, raise our family, but as soon as we see the police, we get anxiety. Right? And of course, not all 100% of blacks feel this way. Some blacks is, heal themselves to a certain extent and may not be under that form of trauma and ain't worried about the police. I ain't did nothing. I ain't worried about the police. Some people are like that, and that's a blessing for them. But oftentimes, many of us aren't in that condition. We are fearful of the police. The anxiety of court and the judicial process. We have anxiety about court to such an extent that some of us may get a minor infraction, a ticket, and will be fearful to go to court, thinking that they're going to lock us up. One young man just told me today, he was telling me his situation with his licensing and how the judge threatened to lock him up and told him, I'll call your job right now and tell him you're not coming to work tomorrow. You know why the judge was talking to him like that? Because he missed the court day. He was scared to go to court thinking they was going to lock him up just for a ticket. But he was scared to go to court. So just think, now that he's scared to go to court because of the psychological trauma of being in court, being held in authority by a judge, just think of the anxiety he has, fearful that he has a warrant. Right? Think what it's doing to him genetically. We're going to talk about some of the genetic effects of trauma. Think what it's doing to him. Think that what that's doing to him, he's passing on to his child. So his child, 1 or 2 years old, will be sitting in the back seat of a car, see him driving, knowing he has a warrant, knowing his license is suspended, and he sees a cop and he's scared, he clambers up. That is impacting the child. This is what's happening regularly as a result of all these systematic situations that is impacting us. The sorrow of being in jail or prison. Just think what that's like to be in jail. For some of you that haven't been in jail, you can only imagine what the sorrow a person must feel to be incarcerated, enslaved, away from their family and loved ones, away from children. It's unbelievable. Depression as a result of the loss of a family member to incarceration. A mother, for example, who the husband is the breadwinner. Do you know how many mothers had children whose husbands were lynched, taken away and sold off into peonage convict leasing, and was left to fend for themselves in the 1920s, in the 1890s? Can you imagine what is impacting that mother? Do you know the story of Malcolm X when his mother's husband, his father, was killed in Lansing? She had to now take care of these children. As a result, the system came in slowly but surely, began taking the children from her to such an extent that then she had to get hospitalized in a mental institution in Kalamazoo. Mm-hmm. That's just one sign, one example of what's been happening to us. Malcolm was sent away to go live with his family in Boston. His other brother was sent to go live here, live there, separated from each other. You can't understand this because we're not taught it to us in this way. This is all hidden. We're in denial that this has happened because we still are in denial about slavery, about the effects of it. That was in the past. You're not a slave today. How are you affected by what happened 300 years ago? Let me show you. Let me break it down for you. All of these issues and topics we're discussing are direct relational to our history, our generational history in America of racial oppression and social segregation. The reality of prison being the fate of youth. Like, that is devastating. Like I told you, when I was a child, I was told that I was going to be dead or in prison by the time I was 18. Can you imagine what that's doing to me psychologically? Let me tell you what it did to me, for example. How many people have seen the movie Colors? Colors. When Colors hit, right? When Colors came out in the late 80s, by 1986, 87. We were so entrenched in the street life at that time that we believed that we were going to die or go to prison. In the movie, toward the end of the movie, there was two gang members on opposite sides that having a shootout with each other. Or I forget the two names of the two gentlemen. But they both were shooting and spraying their machine guns. And they ran out of bullets. They went to pull out their clips and reload. And they looked at each other in the eyes. And they both had guns. And they looked at each other. And they both just started shooting at each other until they both shot and killed each other. Let me tell you the devastating effects of that. For a child like me to carry guns every day, that at that time when I was watching that movie, I had a gun on me, in my possession, and dope in my pocket. When I seen that, because I believed that I was either going to be in prison or I was going to be dead, I fantasized about that moment. I fantasized about it. Mm-hmm. So from that moment on, I never ever ran from nobody with a gun. Luckily, survived the shooting. Two of my friends got hit, and they got hit pretty bad, but I survived the shooting because I didn't run. Everyone who ran got hit. And I didn't even run. I stood there and looked at him as he cocked the shotgun and shot at us with these buckshots. And everyone got hit. And I stood there and looked at him. And he looked at me, put his shotgun back in his trunk, shut it, and drove off. But because I wasn't fearful, because I was living for that moment, because I believed that that was going to be my fate anyway. So what I'm going to run for my fate for if you pull out a gun on me? Another guy pulled a gun out of me, stuck it to my stomach, and said, I got a gun, give me your drugs. I looked at the gun and hit him in his mouth. Wasn't even fearful. You see what was happening to me? The psychosis of that, of the trauma, of believing in my own fate, that I was either going to be dead or in prison. Like, that is a sickness that is impacting our youth. So we wonder why they're not fearful to die today. Mental health deterioration as a result of incarceration going untreated. These are some of the traumatic devastations of the criminal justice system and what it's doing to us. Let's get into another discussion about something important. PTIS, as I call it, or Present Traumatic Incarceration Syndrome. We haven't heard of that because, even though I'm not a doctor, I created that term, right? Because it's the result of my understanding of what happened to me and what happened to us generationally, right? We have a present traumatic incarceration syndrome. Present. We're living with this present trauma right now, today. In conjunction with PTSS, or post-traumatic slave syndrome, blacks in America now suffer from present traumatic incarceration syndrome, otherwise known as the trauma of mass incarceration. PTIS, or a present traumatic incarceration syndrome, is a condition that exists as a consequence of the generational psychosis of histories of forms of enslavement, incarceration, and constant supervision. So it's real. It's real to me. Right? Present traumatic incarceration syndrome is real to me. I lived it. Spent 15 years in prison for crime I didn't even commit. Right? Not to mention, leading up to that, all the times I was in and out of juvenile, in and out of jail. Now let's talk about something that's very deep. It talks about the connection between trauma and how it's generationally handed down. The epigenetics of black life in relation to generational trauma. How many people know about epigenetics? Epigenetics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Y'all know about epigenetics? Y'all deep, man. Y'all some scientists back there. That's what's up. Epigenetics is the field of study of how the experiences of previous generations can affect who people are in the present. You hear that? Epigenetics is the field of study of how the experiences of previous generations can affect who people are in the present. In the ultimate intersection, it is the ultimate intersection between your current lifestyle and your health outcomes as a direct result of the epigenetics of your past. Listen. Epigenetics tells us how certain lifestyle factors such as diet, stress, and exercise can change the way your genes are expressed. The way your genes are expressed. Your epigenetics then tells you your general well-being, your risk for certain diseases, and the prognosis for your health outcomes. Right? Epigenetics is very serious and it's tied directly into generational trauma. Because as I mentioned, when Nicoya gets here in a couple months, she's going to be talking about the health outcomes of trauma. What happens physiologically to the body when it's under trauma? What is happening to the genes? How are they being rewritten, rewired, based on the trauma that that person is experiencing? The health outcomes of the trauma of mass incarceration. The epigenetics of one's history impacts a person's pre-birth. Meaning that before you're born, what's happening in the life of the parent before you is already going to impact you because now their genes are being rewritten. Their genes are being re-expressed. So now they're handing that on to you. Right? That's why they say that children share the experiences of their parents in the trauma. One's adverse childhood experiences begin in adolescence. One begins to experience disrupted neurodevelopment. Thereafter, social, emotional, and cognitive impairments set in. One begins to adapt to health risk factors. Like, for example, one of my health risk factors was early death or incarceration. So my adaptation to it was to live it out. Right? You know what I mean? You know how people get sick and they be like, but you got cancer because you smoke cigarettes. And you be like, well, I'm going to die anyway. Right? I'm going to die anyway. Or you ain't got cancer yet, but you involve yourself with something that could cause cancer, and so you say, well, we're going to die of something anyway. Might as well be this because I enjoy smoking. Right? So we begin to adapt to it. We begin to adapt to it by substance abuse. Right? Some of us, we don't understand why our kids come to school high, smoking weed. Well, you don't understand that oftentimes our kids, the life that they're living, they want to escape that. They don't want to deal with the reality of coming from home from poverty. Coming from home from having barely, coming down at nighttime to go to the refrigerator and just ain't nothing there. Right? Or having come to school the next day, having heard gunshots at night. Somebody down the street they knew got killed. And they got to come to school the next day and you expect them to come to school sober. They can't cope. Children aren't designed to cope. And so they smoke weed or drink or use other drugs as a means and method of coping. So that the reality of what they're facing is not present. Because as we know, many substances, or if not most substances, they remove the reality of what you're really facing. So you don't have to deal with the responsibilities. So you smoke or use drugs to escape that. So we adapt, we create these adaptive behaviors to adapt to the trauma we experience. Disease, disability, and social problems occur in mass. Meaning that things just begin to just hit us. Bam, 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 bam. A whole bunch of things are impacting our health outcome. All of this leads to early death. And so as I'm approaching 50 in a few years, I'm thinking about how many people in my lifetime, in my generation, that are dying. People who were born in the late 60s, they're dying. At 50, at 48, at 52, at 54, they're dying. It's unbelievable how many people are dying at such young ages from my generation, the generation that was born after the Civil Rights era, right? The late 60s, early 70s, these young people are dying. Two of my good friends died 2 weeks apart. Gina Poole and Tony Jackson. They died a couple weeks apart. This was about 4 or 5 years ago now. They was only, 43, 44. They gone from cancer. Unbelievable. So what do we do as a result of this? How do we address this severe traumatic experiences that are impacting our health outcomes? How do we approach this? Well, one of the resources that I advocate for is using a healing-centered approach, healing-centered engaged approach, that we're going to center our healing in a form of engagement that allows us to actually act upon and do something about to redress the trauma, right? To redress the trauma. So because it's psychological, right, it begins psychologically and it affects us physically, psychologically is where we have to begin. Psychologically is where we have to begin. So I'm going to teach you a little about the healing-centered engagement versus trauma-informed care. This series is a trauma-informed seminar series because we have to educate you and inform you about the traumatic impacts that's happening in people's lives, right? To get to a treatment, to get to healing, right? To get to an approach. After we're trauma-informed, now how do we go about healing ourselves and healing our community? So trauma-informed care is both an organizational structure and a treatment framework that involves understanding. Like we're starting to become more understanding of what's happening to people. Our teachers are starting to become more understanding that children come here in poverty and poverty causes trauma. So we're starting to be more understanding, recognizing and responding to that trauma. Right? That's on us as individuals that come in contact with people with trauma. That's what trauma-informed care is really all about. Because if you're not understanding, if you're not open to have that kind of recognition, then you're going to put barriers up, like we talked about with childhood experiences, ACEs. Children are coming to school showing signs and symptoms of traumatic experiences, and because our schools aren't trauma-informed, don't have the education, don't have the recognition, they castigate that behavior, those signs and symptoms of trauma, as bad behavior. And they discipline that behavior. They discipline a disease, an illness. They punish it, suspend it, expose it. Right? In which John Wilkie, when he comes, he's going to talk about that. That's really what he's going to be really digging deep into, some of the impact of our children's trauma in our school systems, our school settings, and how that is leading to mass incarceration. Right? The effects of that. School push-out, as it's called. So they're responding to the effects of all types of diagnosed and undiagnosed trauma. But healing-centered engagement is holistic, involving culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing to restore a person's sense of being. Because remember, when you're traumatized, you lose a sense of self. One of the first things that happens to a person that's in trauma, when they get shot, they disconnect it from their self. And they lose connection to themselves. Some people never find themselves back to themselves. And they stay disconnected for decades, if not forever. And collective healing to restore a person's sense of being, giving them a cultural and holistic outlet to cope with their trauma and heal from its effects. For example, the Civil Rights era, that was the healing-centered engagement model. What they did was it said that in order for us to heal from the trauma of being lynched, from the trauma of being socially segregated, from the trauma of being economically depressed and deprived, right, and opportunities stripped from us. In order to heal from that, first and foremost, we got to get into action about this. We have to challenge this. And in challenging it, they have to have a belief in themselves. Without a belief in yourself that you're worthy of the opposite of what you're experiencing, then you can't do anything about your trauma. See? So the people who experience sexual trauma, for example, they live in shame for so long that they stay in that trauma, and then that trauma produces other symptoms that impact them and impact their children. But once you start saying to yourself, I'm worthy, that I didn't deserve that trauma, that I'm just as worthy as the next person in humanity, that I'm great, that the creator of humanity has made me special, in spite of what happened to me. In spite of the trauma I experienced, I have to have a belief in me that I'm capable of being greater than the problem that impacted me. So that's what happened in the Civil Rights era. They started to have a sense of belief in self, a sense of self-esteem, that I'm black and I'm proud to be who I am, and I deserve rights. I deserve to be free. I deserve to have equal opportunity, right? Because now you can address the trauma. You can address what's causing the trauma. And then you can really settle with what experience happened to you. Because you know it wasn't your fault. You see, it wasn't your fault that you were raped, that your father was lynched, right? That you were enslaved. That wasn't your fault. Once you accept it wasn't your fault, then you can activate a response and get into action to redress that. Once you get into action to redress and you ultimately gain your freedom, right? Then you can really settle in your freedom. You're healing from that. So that's what healing-centered engagement is all about. The healing-centered approach, it views trauma not as an individual isolated experience. It highlights the ways trauma and healing are experienced collectively. It offers an asset-driven approach aimed at the holistic restoration of young people's well-being, using the opposing question of what happened to you to what's right with you. Right? Instead of, oftentimes with trauma we talk about, what's wrong with the person, we say, what happened to you? So we can understand and recognize what experiences you had. But now, in healing-centered engagement, we get past that, beyond that, by saying, okay, we know that happened to you. We know you got locked up when you was 4 years, taken away from your parents and put in foster care when you was 4 years old. Tell me about you right now. What's going on right in your life right now? And if you can identify, for example, well, I'm smarter in school. I'm talented. I'm an artist. Then we say, oh, you're an artist. Oh, let's take you over here down in Washington White Pot. We're going to support you to actually express your artistry. So then we can find a way to use your artistry, your talent, to redress what caused your problem. So you're saying that you were taken from your mother, put into foster care. Well, let's tell your story in art then. Matter of fact, let's take you on a tour, take you to schools, so you can share your story with other young people and empower them to heal from the same thing that you've experienced. Now that child now being empowered to redress their trauma, using something that's right about them, their talents, their gifts, that begins to recenter them, recenter their purpose, recenter their being. Right? That's the healing-centered engagement approach as a result of trauma. So it's very powerful, very asset-driven. So what are the pathways to restoring well-being? Healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded. Views healing as the restoration of well-being through identity. Rooting young people in a solid sense of meaning, self-perception, and purpose. Highlighting shared or collective identity such as race or ethnic value, gender, and sexual exploitation. Why are these important? Because these are the areas that are repressed, that are suppressed, that produces trauma. Right? These are the specific places in slavery you were taught that you weren't worth anything, that you were a slave, you were 3/5 of a human being. So in order to combat that, we have to give you a sense of self-esteem in who you are. No, you're Fulani. You're West African. You're Bantu. You come from great empires, right? Accept the value of who you are, so we begin to re-envision that in them. Teach them a sense of self-being and self-worth, right? So people that's been sexually exploited, we tell them that your bodies are a sacred symbol. That, yeah, someone violated you, but that is not the definition of who you are, right? It's not your fault. That your body is sacred, and you have the right to determine how you utilize it, right? So we have to recenter that. Building a healing-centered engagement model, how do we do that? We start by building empathy, leading to a trusting connection by sharing stories of caring adults who take a risk of their own vulnerability. Here we're talking about mentoring, right? We know the power and value of mentoring. When we connect with a young person and can identify with them and share with them our personal struggles and stories that they can identify with and say, wow, there's other people like me. When I used to go into schools, especially in Detroit, because so many young people have been victims of firearms, have been shot, I used to take off my hat, show them my bullet wounds. Show them my bullet wounds in my head, on the back of my head right here, tell them I survived being shot too. Shot too, left for dead. Just like a lot of y'all was. I experienced that. My family experienced that. Of me nearly dying. Being shot in the head. in 1990 when I was 17 years old. A lot of these kids, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, have been shot. And when I can go in there and share that with them, then they can feel more relaxed and open up to me and find a connection. So now we can get connected, right? We can get connected. They can get a connection to a source of healing because perhaps if I survive that and I'm doing well in life, they got a chance. Right? So we build that relationship. Then we encourage young people to dream and imagine, to inspire them to see beyond the condition, event, or situation that caused trauma in the first place. We have to help them see the world, the future, without that trauma. Right? So the trauma's in the past for them. We build a critical reflection to take loving action by helping young people develop and analyze, or develop an analysis of the political, social, and systematic practices that facilitated the harm, and support them in responding to the political and policy decisions and practices that can exacerbate trauma. So therefore, we work in schools to organize school walkouts when schools are repressive and unjust, right? We lead peace marches in our community to redress the violence that's happened in our community. We promote healthy schools. Trent, what we do, we had the Youth Action Radio Network, YARN, right? We brought in the health department to come talk to our youth on our live radio show about the negative health impact of some of our school lunches. That empowered them who come to school and hate to look at that tray. We empowered them to actually redress it. So we said, let's empower you, let's talk to people to inform you and educate you about actually what is healthy. So we brought Julie Weisbro, for example, into T.A. Wilson. And she was live on the air on our radio network and talked about it and told them what was healthy and what was not healthy. What should a healthy school lunch look like? What should it consist of? How many calories should they eat? And to also talk about the value of coming to school having ate fruit, right? Having had a breakfast in the morning. What it does to the genetics of the person, having them prepared and ready for learning. And so we empower them by giving them a platform to redress the inadequacies in their school lunches, right? So that's some of the actions that you have to do. So this healing-centered engagement model is extraordinarily intricate to healing from trauma. And it's something that's picking up steam in the black community as we're really systematizing what this looks like. Because it's existed before, we just didn't have a framework for it. We didn't have, an approach that was methodical that we could really look at and say, this is the system, this is the method, this is the approach. And these are the points about how we go about doing that. So healing-centered engagement is very, very critical to healing from trauma to trauma mass incarceration. The trauma mass incarceration is really the trauma of modern-day enslavement. Like, we really have to identify it as that because that's really what it is. We have to see it that way because if we don't, we're going to be misled by the political language of safety in the community. We have to, crime or the rule of justice must prevail in society. Like, those are some of the catchphrases that are used, right, to hide some of the design behind some of the policies and legislation that keeps modern-day slavery intact as modern-day incarceration, right? So we have to really, really talk about that and have that conversation. These are all the sources. They are on each slide. They're in the packet that you guys have, so you can go back and read more in depth of the material that I use and study and read. And really, this is just the surface. I've been reading and studying this subject for 2 decades, really longer, 3 decades, since the early 90s. And it's been informing me. And the new material is updated, new statistics is updated. So a lot of this is newly updated material. You see Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, probably one of the most important books to really understand the modern-day slave system today, modern-day incarceration. Before the Mayflower, it's very important to understand the history of America and blacks in America in the early days. Slavery by another name talks about peonage, the history, after the Renaissance and what was really happening, convict leasing. Like, it really talks about slavery as another name, that we're still living in a slave society. Like, we still have modern-day slaves. We just disguise it so cleverly that we don't think of it in those terms. We don't see the court system as being complicit in modern-day slavery. What else is up here that's important? Michael Guasco. This is important. The misguided focus on 1619 at the beginning of slavery. That is important study and research because we limit our total knowledge of the history of slavery in America in 1619 when it was some 12-odd Negroes that were here in Jamestown, et cetera, et cetera. There was already slaves here long before then. They was already bringing expeditions back and forth all through the Americas, right? And we don't talk about that history that much, right? We leave that out. Slavery timeline, it's online. Sentencing Project. If you go to Sentencing Project online, go to their website. The report to the United Nations on racial disparities in the U.S. criminal justice system. Powerful information in there. There was a report that was released to the United Nations. Powerful information there. You'd be surprised at some of the proclamations of the United Nations that they have issued against the United States for what they're doing right now in America. What they're doing. I mean, proclamations by countries all over the world who have grossly condemned the United States. We don't see that. We don't hear that because we think we live in this great society. This great free society. But really, it's just under disguise, man. It's real clever. And we have to get ourselves, well, we would say hip to it. We have to really get hip to what's really happening. So that's pretty much the end of our discussion for tonight. Don't forget, we have these next discussions, November 26th, the trauma of poverty, January 28th, Keisha, who is now joining us today. She's going to be talking about the trauma of the adequate diversity and inclusion. John Wilkie is here. He's going to be talking about education, and the list goes on and on and on, all up to July 21st of next year. So at this time, I would love to entertain some questions. We just really got a few minutes before we really wrap this up. So if anybody has any questions, any discussions, this is an excellent time to have it. Anybody got any questions? Yes, sir.
Have you read the church committee? You heard of the church committee?
The church committee?
After Martin Luther King died in 1970, they had a committee about what's going on with intelligence, stuff like that. It really goes in more in depth about what they was doing, how they pushed not just crack to heroin, and how they had to set up the leaderships and stuff like that, you know, and how COINTELPRO was the same thing as Operation Phoenix in Vietnam.
Yeah, I know about COINTELPRO.
Right, so they was talking about, they was bringing that in Operation Mockingbird, where how there's the disguise and journalism to fit the narrative. You talking about the UN proposal that nobody talk about.
Yeah, right.
The proposal to knock that off the newspaper. Right. We want this on the newspaper, we don't want that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
So is the church committee, is that a publication or is that?
Yeah, it's a 3-book publication that you can get from us.gov.
Nice. Thank you for that. You want something else to add to
Oh yeah, one more thing about the mental thing you was talking about. Yeah. During that time, many people don't bring up the eugenicist programs they had then.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So where we was considered crazy regardless.
Yeah. Planned Parenthood, part of eugenics. And that's one aspect I didn't touch on. And there's, like I said, there's so many chapters to this. There was a eugenics program that started in Europe, really, and came over to America. And it was designed to reduce our population. Planned Parenthood is the direct output of eugenics, the eugenics program, to really strip our population and destroy us, essentially, from within. Yeah.
There's some young boys that's kind of struggling in school, and they want to put them on all kind of medications and label them, and it's really just stifling their whole lives, you know, with all the labeling and the bullying and just in school. What should these mothers be doing, and how can we help these young mothers with their boys and girls, but maybe it's the boys that I see that are struggling at an early age.
It's definitely a very important discussion. And you're a mother yourself, right? And have you been actively involved in your parent or your daughters or granddaughters or whatever's lives, actively advocating? Yeah, that's what I would really say that we need to do more of. Exactly what I know you do is advocate and try to connect your children, grandchildren, and other children of parents that you know to begin to really advocate and find the types of resources and knowledge and information to empower parents. And then once parents are really empowered, parents will begin to then understand that they really have the power when it comes to our school system, because who controls our school system? A school board. Who controls the school board? We do, by electing them. So we as parents, we have to become the elected people to sit on our school. That's who's supposed to be running our school board. It's supposed to be the parents of the children in our community that go to our schools, because they will have the best interest at heart for those children. But oftentimes what we see is that our school boards are made up of people that don't reflect our school board makeup, right? We see that often. So when John comes up, he's going to be talking about more about this. You want to answer that too?
Yeah, are you in the Jackson School District? Are you in Paragon or the Vinci or the public school system?
Public
challenges is, they have a lot of different programs that's been certified by the state. And they brought this from Texas. And so we're working on that in order to get our school. I have my card with me, so I just give you my information. 9:30. 9:30 tomorrow.
I know you had a question, and I got Trent, Selena back here. Mary. Yeah.
People might find out more information and research on epigenetics.
Epigenetics.
Yeah, I see that that's seems to be a problem in brings on stress, brings on different diseases. I was looking at my mother-in-law for her diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and I see like my wife is getting that from the stresses of her parents. I'm trying to find a way to curtail that, how to actually stop that disease.
Yeah.
Epigenetics.
Epigenetics, yeah. Definitely do some more research, Google it, especially Google things like epigenetics and the Black experience, epigenetics and Black health outcomes, and things like that. There's some real deep scholarly articles on it. There's some theses and some PhD dissertations that's been written on it. And of course, oftentimes dissertations aren't published as books, but they're online in PDFs, right? So go read that research that researchers and scholars are writing about this. And it's just not general public information. So definitely do some more research and find out where it leads you and find out how you can get the help and support you need. Yes, Trent.
As somebody that was in school, graduating now, very proud of myself. Thank you. One of my struggles in school was that as a kid, when I was being bullied and I tried to go to the adult for help, I got in trouble. I didn't appreciate being the one that got in trouble for being the person that went to go seeking for help. Yeah. And there was another time when a teacher was the bully. I had fell outside in some mud and I came inside the classroom and she said, "What you do, shit yourself?" And the whole class started laughing. And I felt like she had no right to say that, but nobody did anything about it.
Right. And see, we've been seeing more statistics about the impacts of bullying in schools and how children aren't supported when it comes to bullying until it reaches a boiling point, and then all of a sudden now people want to start figuring out what's the problem. But by then it's too late. And exactly what you said, we do see bullying from teachers, repressiveness from our teachers, disrespect from our educators. And so hopefully when John really gets to his topic, really talking about education, he can pull in all those discussions and really talk about how those things are impacting children. Because we know that particularly children that's been labeled as special education or labeled alternative school, right? They suffer the most trauma in our schools, a trauma that we don't really address. We attribute to bad behavior, right? We punish them. We punish our children who are labeled special education and in alternative school. We punish them for the traumas that they experience when they come into school for their so-called bad behavior. So I understand what you're saying. I'm glad you commented and mentioned on that. That it helped John as he prepares his presentation.
I got labeled inside the special needs classroom because I didn't want to stay in class because this teacher refused to help me.
Right.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I went to the teacher dentist school. And I always worked the student. Not always smart. Teachers are human.
Yeah.
But guess what? They got issues too.
I know.
So, it takes a special person not just to be a teacher, but it takes a special person to know their purpose and what they're here for. So, I hope you can make it.
Oh yeah, I was lucky to go to an alternative school with a teacher named Joanna Perkins. She was part of the Be More Kind program. And she would say every morning she said to her students, "We were all created to do great things."
That's true. And I believe that. I believe you are special too. But that don't mean you special alternative.
Right.
So, like I said, hopefully you can make it in February.
11th.
Or you can get my card, because I do mentorship also.
Right. Selena?
Tasha Carter has a question. She said on your live feed that she'd like you to answer. She just texted me. That was mine.
Was the questions on live feed?
From Tasha Carter.
I'm trying to be all in your business.
This trauma series is impactful, but the people that are really suffering are not at the library right now, listening and are not watching this series. How might we
even though we recognize a lot of people, aren't necessarily here, there's several dozen people here today, but really it begins with us having these first conversations. Like this series is really the first time we began addressing this and having these conversations. The momentum of this is what we do as a community in response to this. How do we then respond to this and say, for example, one, we need more conversations like this. Two, where do we have these next rounds of conversations at? Who do we need to bring into the room or bring into the space or bring into the table as we begin to have the conversation about where we have these next conversations at, so that the people that are not in this room, ultimately, we are in the room with. So I would say that that's pretty much an answer to the question. This is the beginning of these types of conversations. Like I said, these are new conversations. We're not traditionally having these conversations. And that's the reason why we brought this series here, so we can have these conversations and then ask the follow-up question, what are we as a community going to do next? Marion.
I've been following the lawsuit of a black entertainer. Well, he's not an entertainer. He owns a company in Hollywood that has a lot of black entertainment programs, and he's suing Comcast for not carrying him because he's black. It's now going to the Supreme Court in November.
Byron Allen?
Mm-hmm. That's him.
And if Comcast wins, we're going to lose a bunch of what's always been present in the 1866 Civil Rights Law.
Yeah, it's good you mention that too, because we've always been denied the opportunity to be owners, right? And so he's been blocked from buying networks over and over and over and over again, in spite of the fact that he has the money. But he's been denied intentionally by racial bias, right? Intentionally designed to keep him from owning networks, from owning stations, and et cetera, so he could broadcast his programming, right? Which is one of the reasons why, BT got sold, right? Now BT used to be black owned, is no longer black owned. And we see what it's deteriorated to.
Yeah.
Right? BT used to have a lot of other programming, educational programming, news and things of that nature. And it's gotten so much further away from that as a result of the black exploitation of its business, right? And so with Byron Allen, we hope he wins, and we should all plug into that, find out more about what's happening with the Byron Allen case, and see how that connects to some of this information we're talking about with intentional design to continue to racially repress certain peoples in society and keep people ignorant for the most part, right? Because he has a lot of educational, very important programming. Some of his shows still come on late at night, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And you can see some of the things he does. And he's a great producer of television shows. He produces some great shows. A lot of us just are unaware of what he has going on. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's a billionaire. If he's not a billionaire, he's close to it. He's very wealthy, and he's done a lot of great things, and he has the money to buy networks. So definitely. Who else has some questions?
I got one more.
Yeah.
She kind of touched on it too about the legislation or the legal, what I'm saying? And you touched it about the Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. How come people are not really talking about the '94 crime bill? You know what I'm saying? The 1986 with Reagan passed the drug laws, boosting the crime, and then things like that, or the No Child Left Behind Act. Right. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that's one of the other things, like I said, there's so many layers to this conversation about mass incarceration. In 1994, Bill Clinton, of course, signed the crime bill. The many politicians today who we think might want to vote for president was integrally involved in making sure the crime bill got passed. That crime bill is what helped skyrocket the prison population. It helped expand length of sentences. The crime bill is a result of that. No Child Left Behind is what kicked off the school-to-prison pipeline. Right? And this is the reason why they've done away with the No Child Left Behind and created what's called the ESSA Act, Every Student Succeeds Act, right? So there's a lot of moving pieces in this broader discussion. Like I said, to really have this discussion, we need a weekend. Yeah. We need today, we need tomorrow morning, see you on the morning at breakfast time, plenary session, you know what I mean, the keynote in the afternoon, you know what I mean? Like, that's what we really need. In order to get through all this information and knowledge, you know what I mean? There's only so much we can unpack in the time frame we have allotted. But that's important to talk about the '94 crime bill and how it ultimately changed the face of America, changed mass incarceration greatly. And there's so many other pieces.
Private prisons.
The privatization of prisons. I was incarcerated in a private prison for 4 years, so I know about CAA, Corrections Corporation of America. But in a nutshell, this has been a great opportunity to present to you guys. We have to wrap this up. Thank you.
All right, y'all. That's it.
On this table, I have some postcards. Please take one. Put 3 stickers on it with 3 of the things you agree with the expungement bill. Get that back to me, and so I can turn that in next week. As the House Committee is now voting on a new expungement law, and we hope for this to help show them that we are serious as a community about passing this legislation. So thank you all for coming tonight.
All right, y'all. That's the end of the peace. That's the end of it right there. You know what I'm saying? Of the once a month going on for a while. Feeds about the black community. Nice seeing you. You know what I'm saying? Nice to meet you too. And this is a wonderful thing. We got a nice little crowd out here. It's a nice little wonderful thing. Hey, thanks what's up, cuz. Much love from Baltimore. You know, one of the things that really impacted me in this was when and I ain't really asking about it, was, you know, the movies. When he talked about the movie in colors and stuff like that. And I distinctly remember that part. He talked about how everybody wanted to go out like that. It was Crazy Tunes with the White Fence Gang. And it was my man Rocket from the Crips, played by Don Cheadle. You know what I'm saying? And they got in the front yard, you know, the Crips and the white boys, the Crips and the Mexican gangs got into it, and they blew each other away, you know what I'm saying, the Mexican gang. And I started thinking, like, it was always some type of Hollywood thing where they showed this how a gangster nigga supposed to act, you know what I'm saying? It used to be, in the 70s, it was Superfly, you know what I'm saying? During this time in the 80s, some of the movie Colors, you know what I'm saying? In my generation during the 90s, it was O-Dog, you know, Menace to Society. Everybody wanted to be O-Dog. Everybody wanted to be Bishop in Juice, Tupac character and stuff like that. 10 years ago, about 10, 15, 10 and a half years ago, it was Omar, Stringer Bell, cats like that everybody wanted to do, you know what I'm saying? So this is what happened. That's why I'm glad somebody brought up about Brian Allen, you know what I'm saying? Because we don't control the narrative of how these characters and stuff like that supposed to act on TV, you know? And that's another thing about blessing about YouTube and these social media things and stuff like that. We can all start ourselves to do the things that we need to do, to show black characters the way they're supposed to be shown, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, overall it's a good one, you know, good show. I might be down here for the next one, you know what I'm saying? I'm going to have one at the King Center not too long ago on the south side of my city where I stay at. You know, but it's time to get out to start, you know, saying things of this nature. Anyway, much love to all the people that have watched the show, you know what I'm saying? Much love to y'all. Much respect. And see you on the next one. Don't forget to tune into my YouTube station. Gotta plug that. What's up, my brother? You know what I'm saying?
I like this, brother. Come back down here, man.
Yeah, come on back down, you know. Yeah, media is everything. Yes, that's correct. Media is everything. Hey, make sure you plug into my YouTube station, CLR James. You know what I'm saying, on YouTube. Plug into that. You know what I'm saying? We do a lot of Black and African history. We show stuff like this in lectures, events. Anyway, much love. RBG. Peace.